All throughout history, there have been various movements by groups of people who have organized and fought to overthrow the current ruling system. While most attempts ended in failure, every once in a while one would be a massive success. One such example of a revolutionary protest is the Boston Tea Party, when the Sons of Liberty in Boston tore up an entire shipment of tea that had been delivered by the East India Company in order to demonstrate their protest to the Tea Act, which had been imposed by the British Parliament. What was the reason behind it? Why did they trash heaps of tea that was delivered to them? And most importantly, what made this protest such a defining moment in America's history? In today's video, we'll share all the details related to the Boston Tea Party. Back in the 1700s, tea's popularity was not limited to the British Isles. It also spread to the American colonies. The average person used to consume gallons of tea annually. To meet the steadily increasing demand for tea, other competing businesses were established, but in 1721 the British Parliament attempted to end foreign competition by drafting an act. Colonists were only permitted to import tea from Great Britain under this law. In 1767, the British Parliament decided to raise taxes on tea sold for domestic consumption, but much to their dismay, British and British Americans began smuggling tea from the Dutch Republic due to its low cost, as it was not subject to Dutch taxes in the Dutch Republic. People began consuming more of the less expensive smuggled tea, which caused the Parliament to suffer enormous losses. To make up for the losses, the Parliament placed increased levies on a number of imports, including tea. The higher taxes led to a fresh dispute between Great Britain and its colonies. It was 1773 when the Tea Act, established by the British Parliament, granted the East India Company exclusive authority to ship tea to the colonies. This enabled the East India Company to sell tea to colonies directly rather than through third-party merchants, which resulted in an effective reduction in the cost of tea, allowing it to compete favorably with tea that had been smuggled. However, the colonists realized the British were trying to pull one over on them, and they protested loudly. The leaders of many major cities in the colonies canceled their orders in protest, but the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony allowed tea to arrive in Boston. On December 15, 1773, the Beaver ship made her way to Griffin's Wharf in Boston as the third and last ship to set sail from London, England. Due to an outbreak of smallpox on board, the Beaver had to spend 2 weeks in quarantine in Boston's outer harbor. Over 100 chests of British East India Company tea were transported by the Beaver and the other two ships, Dartmouth and Eleanor. The tea was stated as being of the Bohea variety and originated from China. Green tea from the Chinese province of Anhui was also included in the shipment of British East India Company tea. The duty on tea, which has been in place with the passage of the 1767 Townshend Revenue Act, had to be paid as soon as the tea was unloaded from the Beaver, Dartmouth, and Eleanor when the 3 shipments of British East India Company tea arrived in Boston. The payment of the tax had to be completed within the absolute time limit of 20 days after the tea had been delivered. If the tax was not paid within the first 20 days after the arrival of the ships, the authorities had the right to take both the ships and their cargoes of tea produced by the British East India Company. The 17th of December was the due day for the payment of the tax on the tea that Dartmouth had delivered to Boston. However, at the end of November 1773, when Dartmouth arrived, the Sons of Liberty began distributing leaflets around Boston streets with the message stating the arrival. Meetings were held every day in Boston for the next 20 days after Dartmouth's arrival to discuss what could be done about the shipments of detested tea. The Boston Tea Party was planned by the Sons of Liberty under the leadership of Samuel Adams. The arrival of Eleanor and Beaver in December heightened tensions to dangerous levels. As the deadline for paying the tax on Dartmouth's tea swiftly approached, a large-scale meeting to discuss the tea issue was scheduled for Tuesday, December 14th at the Old South Meeting House. The Sons of Liberty had made a secret strategy if the tea crisis couldn't be handled through diplomatic negotiations. In addition, the towns that were located in close proximity to Boston received word of the conference, and communities all around the state of Massachusetts submitted their support in the form of proclamations. The Patriots were adamant about not unloading the tea, and they demanded that the ships leave Boston in order to take the tea and its cargo back to England without them having to pay the tax. Thomas Hutchinson, the Lieutenant Governor and Chief Justice of Massachusetts, on the other hand, demanded that the tea be immediately unloaded and the tea tax be paid. and he would not permit the ships to go until the tea was emptied. None of the owners or commanders of the Beaver, Dartmouth, or Eleanor wanted to put their ships in danger by attempting to sail away from Boston without first receiving authorization from the government to do so. If they made an attempt to depart, the ships stood the possibility of being captured by British cruisers or being attacked by Castle William, which was a fort that defended the entrance to Boston Harbor. While their destinies were being decided, the captains and crews of the Beaver, Dartmouth, and Eleanor waited patiently at Griffin's Wharf. On the morning of Thursday, December 16th, the day before the deadline for the payment of the tax on Dartmouth's tea was due, thousands of people from all around Massachusetts gathered in Boston. They gathered in the streets at Griffin's Wharf, the Green Dragon Tavern, and the Old South Meeting House. It is believed that 5,000 to 7,000 people showed up. More than a third of all Boston residents were present in the gathering. Midnight was the cutoff time for making the payment of the tea tax, and a decision regarding what would happen next needed to be taken as soon as possible. It was the evening of December 16, 1773, when the Sons of Liberty, armed with various axes, broke open 340 British East India Company tea boxes that were on board the Beaver, Dartmouth, and Eleanor that had weighed about 92,000 pounds and tossed them into Boston Harbor. 10,000 pounds sterling of the East India Company's tea was destroyed that night. The Boston Tea Party was reported to have cost the British East India Company 9,659 pounds in damages. The news of the Boston Tea Party reached London, England on January 20, 1774. As a result, the British locked down Boston Harbor until all 340 chests of tea owned by the British East India Company were paid for. This was implemented under the 1774 Intolerable Acts and known as the Boston Port Act. The Boston Tea Party was the first major act of resistance committed by American colonists and is often regarded as the foundational moment in the development of the United States. The Boston Tea Party had significant consequences and impacts, which ultimately led to the beginning of the American Revolution on April 9, 1775, in the state of Massachusetts. So, what are your thoughts on this revolutionary act of defiance portrayed to the people of Boston? Post your answers in the comments section below.